Hi, this is Ms. Hadi from Olympian High School. We're looking at the Dr. Bentley's Traditions and Encounters textbook, chapter 39. We're about to look at this section on independence in Asia to support your reading. So the first thing we want to do is make sure we know what we're talking about when we say Asia. So all of this is Asia, right? So Europe and Asia are connected. Sometimes you'll hear historians call them Eurasia or Eurasia Africa, because technically Africa is connected as well. So then let's break down Asia a little bit further. Obviously, you've got Europe on that side, and you've got here, if you go straight south, you've got South Asia. So typically when people say South Asia, they mean people who are Indian, Pakistani perhaps. Okay, so South Asia is India. So we need to change. Sometimes students come to our class and they think of Asians as only being, from China and Japan. No, we need to think of Asians. We need to think also that South Asians are included. Over here we have Southwest Asia. So this is where I'm from. I'm technically Asian, but we typically don't call Southwest Asia. We call it the Middle East. So just be aware of that. So you've got the Middle East or Southwest Asia, you've got South Asia, and then over here you have East Asia and Southeast Asia. So just a reminder about what we mean when we say Asia. And then quickly before I start, here's the reference to that video that I mentioned, Gandhi. It's the 1982, and this is just a clip that you could watch for extra credit. And then you should do some additional research on Ahmed Sukarno, who I'll be mentioning today. So a couple of things to start, and then let's just quickly jump into this reading. So there's an introduction to this section, and it tells you about how Asia is going to accomplish independence. There's going to be a lot of Asian nationalism. They're going to have to deal with colonialism and imperialism. So it starts off with South Asia, specifically with India. So again, pointing to the map, let me show you where that is. So here's India. Now remember, all these boundaries have changed, and Pakistan didn't used to exist. It used to be part of India. Okay, so we're trying to figure out how it went from being colonized by the British, the imperial power of the British, to becoming independent. So it'll start you off with a little bit about some of the efforts that were made in the past towards independence. So it'll mention Mohandas K. Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, which we've talked about in the past, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who represents the Muslims and the Muslim League, and all of their efforts towards building nationalism and trying to become independent of Britain. During World War II, that all paused, that all stopped, because the British, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, were demanding Indian support for World War II. However, after World War II, there's this turning point where the calls for independence become stronger, and the British people vote Churchill out of office, and they support an independence movement. And Britain had already experienced going through a decolonization process with Canada. So they sort of had a blueprint in mind. Now, as it became more and more likely that independence would be a reality, the tension between Muslims and Hindus was exacerbated. Now, this underlying tension was there the whole time. Remember that Muhammad Ali Jinnah represented the Muslims in the Muslim League, and the Muslims in the past, especially during the Great Depression, had felt like they were being taken advantage of by the Hindus. So there was this fear that when the British went home, that their position of power and authority over Muslims would just be basically that they would displace the British as sort of this position of authority over them, that it wouldn't be fair or wouldn't be equal. And so there was a lot of talk about having a separate state for Muslims. And there's this concern about rising communalism. Communalism being when you emphasize more your religious identity than your national identity. So, for example, focusing on being Muslim or being Hindu versus focusing on being Indian. So there are all these negotiations that take place with the British. Here you see Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Gandhi. So Gandhi is Hindu and Jinnah is Muslim. And during all of these negotiations, there were certain demonstrations that fueled the concerns about needing a separate nation. One of those was this day of direct action that is also represented in the movie Gandhi. So when you watch this movie for extra credit, you'll see it. You'll see Gandhi's concern about it. But basically, it was demonstrations held by Muslims that ultimately led to Hindus also attacking the demonstrators. There's this violence and clashing between them. Thousands of people were killed in what came to be called the Great Calcutta Killing. And this only intensified Muslim calls for a separate state. They felt like they couldn't be safe in India. And so Muhammad Ali Jinnah comes to say the only solution to India's problem is Pakistan, creating a separate state of Pakistan. Now, this idea of partition or dividing up India into two separate states was appalling to people like Gandhi, people like Nehru, who wanted India to stay united. But ultimately, that's what's going to happen. There's going to be two separate states formed, one called Pakistan, one called India. And because of that, Muslims are going to leave to go to the land of the pure, Pakistan. And so they're going to leave that area to go to Pakistan, and then Hindus are going to leave Pakistan, what will become Pakistan, to go to Hindu India. Well, it's supposed to be secular, but anyway. So in these migrations, there's thousands of people that die. Some people say 500,000 to 1 million people died in these migrations. 10 million people became refugees. So this is part of the challenge of becoming a nation, a separate nation, and all of the violence that transpired for people as they made it to one state or the other following independence. Okay. Obviously, you read in the vignette about Gandhi's death and how, he was a great leader for his countries, but that this enmity between the two states was a concern, and it was continued to be a problem, especially when there was fighting over certain provinces like Kashmir and who should control Kashmir. And when Pakistan and India fought over Kashmir, it led to them trying to utilize their relationship with the superpowers to their advantage. So it pushed Pakistan to create an alliance with the United States. Meanwhile, India tried to become non-aligned. Non-aligned meaning not choosing to take a side between the United States or the USSR in the Cold War. All of this needs to be looked at through the lens of the Cold War as the larger historical context in the background. So what are the effects? You might be asking, okay, we've talked about historical context. What are the effects of India becoming independent? Lots of effects. We talked about this effect of violence on people and them moving, migrating. You also have other nations seeing India as an example, a precedent that they could follow, a blueprint for their own independence. And so it's going to inspire other independence movements. Not all of the colonial powers or imperial powers will be open to negotiations and talks towards independence. For example, the French and the Dutch really tried to hold on tenaciously to some of their colonies, whereas the British understood that without the cooperation of the colonial people, it wasn't going to work to try to maintain a presence in these places. And so they used the blueprint of what they had done in Canada to try to bring in some of these, decolonize some of these states and then bring them into the British Commonwealth. Okay, as I mentioned, some countries tried to adopt non-alignment. Nehru did this. You also see many leaders of Southeast Asia doing this at the Bandung Conference. I want you to remember the Bandung Conference. Maybe Google it, read about it a little bit more, especially if you're interested in Southeast Asian history, if you're interested in Filipino history, Indonesian history. Learn about Ahmed Sukarno and their attempt to try to stay neutral between the United States and the USSR, trying to push them towards one camp or the other. Now, the countries that were part of the Bandung Conference supposedly were non-aligned, but in reality, they often favored one side or the other. So, for example, the Philippines tended to kind of align themselves with the United States and Cuba with the USSR. But the attempt or the effort was to stay neutral in the Cold War. So you see this pressure by the superpowers as these countries become independent to force people to become capitalist or communist. Okay, so from this, the biggest takeaway that I want you to know is that India will become independent alongside with Pakistan, and that this is all taking place within the historical context of the Cold War, and that this will have an effect on other countries also seeking independence.